For 21 years my life has been defined by protocol. I say this not with pride, nor with fatigue, but with the clinical acceptance of a man who has reduced his existence to procedure. I am Professor Marcus Delaney, medical historian, and my field, though often mistaken for quaint antiquarianism, concerns itself with death on a scale few can stomach. The plagues, the sweats, the coughs that hollowed cities, I trace their paths like a surveyor, following the ink trails of parish clerks and municipal registers, the way a forensic pathologist might follow a bullet track. Each morning, I enter the restricted wing of the university archive with the same motions. The heavy oak door yields only after the weight of my keycard and my signature in the vellum-lined security ledger. An irony not lost on me, that a book is still trusted to record entry, even in the age of digital redundancy. Inside, the temperature never varies from 16 degrees Celsius. The air smells faintly of vinegar and dust, a preservative tang that seems to settle in one's throat. The silence is absolute. A turned page cracks like bone in a crypt. I remove my gloves from their case, flexing the nitrile over my fingers, and only then approach the shelves. Each codex is a patient under examination, its leather skin fissured, its bindings arthritic. I note accession numbers in a leather-bound logbook of my own, a ritual older than my tenure. I do not trust purely electronic records. Redundancy is the historian's only weapon against entropy. The routine is my anchor. Annotation follows handling, cross-referencing follows annotation. Parish burial registers align with city bills of mortality. I mark discrepancies with a neat plus in the margin. This discipline has earned me a reputation. Lectures at Oxford, citations in medical journals, an occasional summons to contextualize some modern outbreak. I have been the calm voice reminding physicians that every epidemic feels unprecedented to its victims. Yet each follows patterns as old as famine and rainfall. I have, throughout, debunked superstition with the confidence of one armed with data. Rats were not omens. Church bells did not banish contagion. Curses did not spread fevers. The archive, I believed, was proof that fear and ignorance were the only contagions that truly endured. And yet, there is one volume I cannot reconcile with any ledger. One book that has refused every protocol I ever trusted. A diary that continues, still, to write itself long after its author has been dust. The diary announced itself with a bead of ink no larger than a tear. I noticed it when I returned from the morning humidity check, a minor ritual in which I confirm that the climate controller still holds the room at 40%. The page I had catalogued the night before, folio 47 recto, should have been bone dry, like all parchment left undisturbed for centuries. Yet there it was, a domed drop clinging to the tail of a letter S, convex and light-catching, as if the quill had only just lifted. I have handled enough 17th century documents to know the smell of iron gall ink, the faint metallic sourness, like rain on an old key. Iron gall is made from tannic acid and iron salts. In common terms, oak galls crushed for their bitterness, iron dissolved to give the ink its dark bite. It bites the page and oxidizes. Once it dries, it is as committed as a scar. Hours, not days, are required for that commitment. I hovered my gloved hand above the script and felt a childish urge to blow across it, to test the dome with breath alone. Professionalism, not piety, pulled me back. I indexed the observation instead. Time, temperature, humidity, folio number, my initials. Then I leaned closer and watched the bead tremble, minutely, undeniably, under the weight of the archive's motionless air. Context before anomaly, procedure before panic. I stepped away and wrote, for the sake of any future reader of my notes, what this book was: a parish scribe's diary from the London plague of 1665. Anonymous, the hand cramped and regular, the spelling of death as death, of fever as fever. Such diaries are not rare. They are workaday ledgers of grief. Births, burials, tithes paid, candles ordered. If you imagine a spreadsheet, you will not be far off. With each line a row of household arithmetic interrupted by catastrophe. I had spent 3 weeks cross-indexing its entries against burial registers and city bills of mortality. The correspondences were exacting. Whoever wrote this had been dutiful to the last. I slid the case open, only far enough to photograph the page, twice with the macro lens, once with the color card for calibration, then sealed the lid and rechecked the nitrogen purge. For the lay reader, sealing fragile documents in an inert gas slows decay. Oxygen is the culprit that encourages rot and chemical reaction. We keep the atmosphere inside those cases more like a spacecraft than a library. I inspected the gasket, the silica gel indicator, the digital readout, all perfect. The bead remained. My first hypothesis was the dullest, condensation. Even in tightly controlled rooms, a warmth from a human body or a draft from a misaligned door can nudge moisture out of the air. Moisture makes old ink look wet, so I let the diary be and, like any good clinician, tested the environment rather than the patient. I set a second hygrometer at page level and logged 5-minute intervals. Nothing drifted. I ran my finger along the glass and found no haze. I reviewed the overnight HVAC printout as one might read an EKG. The line was flat in the best way. No spikes. No troughs. What I could not reconcile even then was the smudge that had not been there the night before. It rode the page like a new bruise, a faint grey brush along the ascender of the H. I recognized it because I caused it. When I catalogued the folio yesterday, my glove had grazed the margin and lifted a dusting of carbon black from a centuries-old correction. The smudge stopped short of the word houses. Now the tail of the S extended through the very area where the smudge had ended. Ink had travelled into the past of the page. I forced myself to articulate that sentence aloud. Ink has travelled into the past of the page. And then I struck it from my notes. Language, if left undisciplined, breeds superstition. I wrote instead, new evidence of liquid deposition post-catalogue, source unknown. I catalogued the diary's other virtues to steady my hands. The leather was lamb, cracked in a network like dry riverbeds. The board edges showed dog ears from centuries of thumbs. The sewing stations were regular. The binder had been competent. The hand, spidery but firm, hid its personality beneath duty. Scribes tend to confess themselves in their margins, and this one had not done so. No prayers crowding the gutters. No curses disguised as abbreviations, stoic to a fault. The next morning ended my easy hypotheses. I returned before the lights fully warmed, the room briefly two-toned, green lamps low, fluorescence reluctant. The case's silica indicator still showed safety. I opened the lid with the small twist of the knurled latch and found, not a bead this time, but an entry. 6 lines, tight and even, concluding precisely where I had left a paper flag to mark yesterday's place. The date, rendered in that neat 17th century hand, was June the 24th. The text was characteristic. Of burials 3, of which 2 by fever, 1 by... Then a word I could not quickly pass, but it was the name that unseated me. Names are the historian's only anchor. They fix grief to a body. This one I did not know from any register. I checked my cross-index. No match. I checked the city bills of mortality from that week. No match. I checked the parish map to see if the place named might have been lost to redistricting. No match. An addition to a finished ledger is a kind of heresy. The dead cannot be rearranged to suit the living. I sat very still, and the archive repaid my restraint with quiet. Then I did what I am trained to do when reality leans. I attempted to falsify it. I examined the pen stroke under magnification. Iron gall darkens over time from brown to black as it oxidizes. Fresh iron gall carries a faint, warm translucence at the edge of its line. The edges were warm. The line left micro ridges where a wet nib had parted the pigment. I dabbed a test strip along the blank lower margin, pH, protein residue, small, non-invasive checks that tell you if a liquid is present and what it might be. They responded with the obedience of a textbook, wet, ink. Because the simplest explanation for the impossible is mischief, I inventoried the room. No one had signed the ledger since me. The security camera above the main door shows only entrances and exits, but I scrolled it anyway, frame by frame, through the night. Nothing but the hourly stutter of the thermostat light. I noted a draft if I held a tissue near the floor, the kind that travels beneath doors like gossip. It did not explain handwriting. I conceded nothing to wonder. I typed an internal memo to facilities asking for a pressure test on the seals and copied the conservation lab for a consult about case gaskets. I affixed a thin archival tape across the lid seam, not a lock, merely a witness. If moved, it would declare itself torn. I placed a blank sheet of modern rag paper 2 folios ahead, trimmed to the exact size of the 17th century page, marked invisibly in ultraviolet ink, the way a shopkeeper marks currency to catch counterfeits. If some force favoured writing, let it write on what I could afford to lose. When I finally sat back, I caught my reflection in the case, my face ringed by the green shade, glasses throwing 2 pale ovals over my eyes like coins. The diary rested between us, indifferent. By noon, my notes had multiplied, but my world had not clarified. The entry's name remained unfindable. The ink remained new. Procedure had not repaired reality. It had only measured its refusal. I typed one more message, with less formality than I like, and sent it to the only person whose skepticism might be as disciplined as mine. Dr. Evelyn Shaw, pathology resident. Assistance requested with ink composition analysis and deposition timing on a 17th century manuscript. Controls in place. Results so far inconsistent with any plausible contamination. Are you available tonight for a preliminary assessment? I sealed the case. The tape lay smooth as a horizon. As I turned off the lamps, the last thing to leave the room was the faintest metallic tang, as if the air itself had bitten down on iron. I locked the door, and for the first time in 21 years, felt that protocol might be walking a step behind something I could not name. Evelyn replied 5 minutes later. I'll bring the chromatography kit. If your book is bleeding, we'll teach it to confess. Dr. Evelyn Shaw arrived at the archive that evening with the economy of movement of someone accustomed to dissecting cadavers. She carried the small black case of her field chromatography kit the way a surgeon carries a tray, balanced, careful, utterly unromantic. She was younger than my students imagined residents to be, late 20s, sharp-shouldered, her hair drawn back not for style, but containment. Her eyes held the weary alertness of those who lived too long with fluorescence. I had prepared the stage as if for an experiment in pathology. The diary's case sat on the centre table. The strip of witness tape remained intact across its seam. The auxiliary hygrometer blinked its stable numbers. My own leather-bound log lay open, recording yesterday's impossible edition and the time-stamped photographs. Evelyn skimmed my notes with the patience of someone trained to regard every claim as provisional. "You think this book is producing entries?" she said finally, the hesitation not mocking but precise. She would not dignify the thought with words like writing itself. "I think," I corrected, "that we may be dealing with contamination or a chemical misinterpretation. I would prefer your expertise before I commit to anything more dramatic." It was the language of triage. Rule out the mundane before entertaining the fatal. She nodded and began laying out the kit, pipettes, vials, chromatography paper. For the uninitiated, chromatography is the act of separating compounds by allowing them to migrate across a surface. Ink, like blood, is not one substance but a mixture. Under separation, its components climb at different rates, leaving bands of colour like a fingerprint. If the diary's ink was old, its fingerprint would match the 17th century reference samples I kept. If new, its bands would betray the freshness of modern contamination. We opened the case. The diary exhaled its odor, parchment warmed by centuries, iron gall sharp as pennies in the mouth. The entry from the day before still glistened faintly in certain oblique angles. Evelyn extracted a microsample from the descender of the letter P. She laid it onto the chromatography strip and submerged it in solvent. The line of ink began its slow climb, colours unfurling like a bruise in time-lapse. She leaned in, lips pressed to silence. When the separation resolved, her face remained neutral, but her silence thickened. This is chemically consistent with historical iron gall. No modern additives, no synthetic dyes. She tapped the upper band with her pen. But this migration profile, she stopped, adjusted her words. This banding is too clean. It shows deposition within the last day. I asked her to clarify from my own notes. She obliged. Old ink migrates unevenly. Its bonds weaken, the tannins bleed outward. New ink travels in sharp lines. This travelled sharp, which means it was written in the last 24 hours. Give or take. She hesitated, then added, and yet chemically it is 17th century ink. She let the sentence hang, as if unwilling to claim ownership of its absurdity. I wrote the conclusion in my logbook, my pen steady though my throat was not, chronology inconsistent, composition authentic, deposition impossible. That night, the diary rewarded our vigilance with another entry. 5 lines dated June the 25th, names again, one of which I recognized. Not from plague rolls, not from old maps, from our own faculty directory. Professor Daniel Mercer, Department of Philosophy, alive, tenure-bound, last seen debating free will in the common room. His name appeared in that spidery hand as neatly as if he had been dead 3 centuries. Evelyn read it twice, her lips shaping the letters. Her clinical detachment wavered. We should tell him, she said, her voice lower now, as if the stacks themselves might overhear. Tell him what? I asked. That a dead scribe has announced his demise in advance? That ink predicts what blood has yet to spill? We could warn him. He could avoid something. Her words triggered an unwelcome analogy in my mind. The tide tables sailors use. Those tables predict the rise and fall of water with clockwork accuracy because gravity dictates the moon's pull. The tides do not exist because the table is written, but the writing is indistinguishable from the inevitability. If this diary functioned as a tide table of mortality, then Mercer's name was already on the shore, waiting. I suppressed the thought and retreated to protocol. We double our controls, I said. If this is fabrication, the mechanism must betray itself under tighter scrutiny. So we sealed the case again, this time with twin tapes, cross-hatched, dated and signed. We placed a second blank parchment between folios, marked with ultraviolet signatures invisible to the naked eye. Evelyn positioned her night vision camera with the care of a coroner adjusting a lens over a body. We logged the exact start time, 21:03 hours. I left the archive then, though my mind remained pacing its aisles. By morning, nothing had shifted. No alarms, no forced entries, the tape pristine. I unlocked the case with the small ceremony of a man unsealing a tomb. The blank parchment we had planted, pristine when placed, now bore ink. Not a random scrawl, but a full line in the same 17th century hand. The letters arched with the same habitual pressure. An obituary, a name, a student from my survey course the previous semester, still breathing somewhere in the city. Her death, the diary claimed, by mishap upon the road. Evelyn swore under her breath. I felt my pulse climb into my ears. The camera footage showed nothing but the stillness of the archive, shelves standing silent, the diary lying closed, not a page turning. And yet the words existed, black as verdict. I turned the folios further. What had been blank pages 2 nights ago now bore paragraphs. Obituaries of strangers, professors, shopkeepers. Some names I recognized, others I did not. Each entry wore the date as calmly as a stone. I remember the exact sensation. Not fear, not yet, but the tightening of a world view under strain. As if a bridge I had walked for 21 years creaked with a crack not of timber, but of time. My training insisted on rationality. My eyes insisted on impossibility. My hand, holding the page flat, trembled. The silence in the archive deepened until I thought I heard beneath the hum of the HVAC the faint echo of a quill, not writing in the present, but bleeding forward from a hand long stilled. Evelyn volunteered to keep watch that night. I told myself it was because her schedule, as a resident, was already nocturnal. But in truth, I could not endure another dawn discovery alone. She set her chair beside the diary's case, notebook balanced on her knees, the night vision camera aimed with forensic patience. I left her there under the green glow of the lamps, the fluorescence timed to cut at midnight. When I returned at 6, she was still seated, rigid as a figure left for dissection. Her notebook trembled in her lap. The case was undisturbed, the twin witness tapes intact. Yet her face was drawn into a mask I had not seen before. The taut skin of disbelief, pressed too long against the immovable. "I heard it," she said. Before I could speak, I asked her to define it. "The sound of a quill," she whispered. And the word quill caught like a splinter, scratching, pausing, as if dipping into an inkwell, then starting again. Not constant, measured, deliberate. The way you breathe when you write slowly. I examined the room as if the air itself might confess. The HVAC grates exhaled their soft, steady sigh. The data logger ticked in half-second intervals. No feathered pen, no ink bottle, no scribe bent over parchment. Yet Evelyn insisted the sound had come from the direction of the case, precisely at 02:47 when she noted the timestamp. Could it have been vibration from the ductwork? I asked. Even to my own ears, the question was desperation disguised as procedure. She shook her head. "I've spent years listening to ventilators and suction pumps. This wasn't mechanical. It was handwriting." Her notebook bore the record. 02:47. Scratching begins. Intermittent for 6 minutes. Pauses consistent with re-inking. I logged her report in my own hand. Objectivity demanded it. Testimony of auditory phenomena time-stamped. Yet my pen faltered at the phrase, "scratching begins." Words meant to describe evidence now carried the weight of superstition. To restore discipline, I contextualized. Diaries are not oracles. They are witnesses. They survive because the human urge to record is stronger than the urge to forget. A diary remembers. It does not predict. Yet the object before us had inverted its role. What should have been memory was now premonition. By mid-morning, the diary confirmed Evelyn's testimony. Another entry. The date, June the 26th. The subject, a student named Clara Hughes, age 19. I recognized her from my last seminar. Front row, always annotating in a neat, looping hand. The cause, written in the archaic phrasing of the scribe. Mishap of carriage and wheel. The words rattled me more than I admitted aloud. Carriage wheel. Anachronism stretched into our age. I filed the entry as I always did. Photographs, ink sample, margin notes. Evelyn watched me, her lips pressed thin, as if silence might hold the world intact a little longer. That afternoon, the news arrived by accident. A colleague mentioned a student death. A car accident, early morning. I asked the name with my voice schooled flat. It was Clara Hughes. The obituary on the university's website appeared before noon. A brief paragraph. An image of her smiling with a graduation cap still in reach. The diary's entry, archaic and cruelly detached, had anticipated the obituary by hours. Evelyn closed her notebook with a snap. This isn't recording. It's causing. Her declaration tore through my rational scaffolding. If the diary was not passive, but active, if ink did not foretell but decree, then every protocol I trusted was inverted. Science relies on reproducibility, but how does one reproduce the handwriting of the dead? I returned to analogies, the only tools left to bridge the gap. A tide table predicts the rise of water because the moon pulls on the ocean. Prediction and cause blur. The table reads like command. Perhaps the diary functioned as such a table, not describing death, but pulling it forward by virtue of inscription. Still, procedure held me upright. We tightened our controls again. I ordered a secondary camera, angled not at the diary, but at its reflection in the glass. I requested decibel meters to capture sound above the threshold of human hearing. Evelyn, pale but determined, agreed to another watch. Yet my narration betrays me. Even as I write these notes, I hear in my memory the faint drag of ink, the way it claws lightly across parchment. I had not heard it then, but now, in recollection, it is as present as my pulse. The entries accelerated over the following days. Names multiplied, not strangers from plague-era London, but men and women I knew. A faculty member, a librarian, a boy in Evelyn's anatomy cohort, each written in that cramped 17th century hand, each dated with calm finality. When Mercer, the philosophy professor, appeared, Evelyn refused to continue reading. She shut the diary with a decisive thud, though we both knew it would open itself again by dawn. I walked her out of the archive that night. The corridor lights flickered under their motion sensors, and for a moment the hall breathed in green pools and sudden black. Evelyn touched her temple as if to ward off a migraine. "Every time it scratches," she said, "I feel like the air itself is listening, like we're not reading history anymore, we're being written into it." Her words, though poetic, struck me with clinical terror. I had always believed the archive preserved human voices. Now it seemed the archive was the voice, and we were the paper beneath its pen. The archive had always been a place of stillness. Even at its busiest, the silence here was cathedral deep, broken only by the turn of parchment, the shift of a chair. Yet by the time we reached the final week of June, that silence felt like breath drawn before speech, a pressure that promised utterance. The diary no longer offered us single entries. It produced whole folios overnight. Where once we had found 6 lines, now we woke to pages soaked in black, line after line of names, obituaries unfurled with an inevitability that left no space for annotation. The scribe's hand remained unchanged. Spidery, neat, archaic spellings consistent across centuries. But the names, God, the names! Faculty members, students, townspeople I passed in the market, politicians on the evening news, each appeared in chronological sequence, as though death itself queued politely to be inscribed. At first, the entries lingered in the near future, a week, a day ahead. But by the third night, the diary surged forward in great leaps, inscribing deaths years into what we still dared call the future. I opened the folio one morning to find my own name. Marcus Delaney, Professor of the Histories of Plague, found in his rooms, Cessation of the Heart, July the 4th. The date was less than a fortnight away. I stared until the letters blurred. For clarity, a man cannot write his own obituary in a script dead for 3 centuries, deposited by ink that has no living hand. Yet there it was, calm and merciless, my death reduced to a ledger line. Evelyn saw it over my shoulder. Her hand covered her mouth, but not quickly enough to stifle a sound halfway between disbelief and prayer. She looked at me as one might look at a patient already gone pale in triage. "It isn't prediction anymore," she said. "It's sentence." I clung to protocol, to science, to the scaffolding of method. We must test again. We must exhaust the mundane before surrendering to the impossible. Radiocarbon dating was my first refuge. Carbon isotopes decay at fixed rates. Every organic material carries its clock. Old ink and parchment betray their centuries by the ratio of C14 remaining. I submitted samples, fragments trimmed from margins under the pretense of conservation. The results were delivered in their sterile envelope 2 days later, 17th century, consistent with 1665. And yet, when tested again from the new entries, the same result. Carbon dated not to the day before, not to the week, but to the same plague years as the original. In other words, the diary wrote in real time, but every entry carried the chemical clock of centuries past, like rain that falls today but dates itself to the Jurassic. I tried spectrography next, forcing the ink under beams of light, scattering its bonds into measurable spectra. For the lay reader, this is how we fingerprint chemicals, the way a prism unpacks light. The results were identical to historical ink, indistinguishable down to the smallest peak. No trace of modern interference, hermetic sealing then. We placed the diary in a fresh case, gasketed and nitrogen purged, our signatures on every seam. The case was welded shut, alarms wired to any breach. And yet by morning the folios bloomed with new names, the ink still wet enough to smudge. Each failed test was a fracture line in my worldview. For 21 years I had insisted that every superstition could be dismantled by method. Now every method I applied confirmed only impossibility. Evelyn's composure faltered. She had been the skeptic, the resident schooled in scalpel and microscope. Now she sat with her face in her hands whispering, "It's not recording. It's deciding. Don't you see? Once the ink is down, the life is over. We're not discovering, we're being written." I tried to steady her, though my own pulse hammered. "History does not author itself," I said, but my voice betrayed me. The truth clawed forward with grotesque clarity. History was not passive, it was active. Texts were not records, they were engines. Every parish register, every bill of mortality I had ever cited. These were not the remnants of human testimony. They were the authors. Humanity was the ink. The archive itself seemed to agree. As I stood among the stacks, I felt vibration through the soles of my shoes. The metal shelves shivered, not from HVAC rumble, but from something deeper, as if the building itself contained a pulse. The cases rattled softly, glass trembling like teeth in cold. The diary lay at the center, its pages flipping of their own accord, not violently, but with the steady turn of an invisible hand. Folio after folio, lines inscribed as we watched. I could smell the ink, iron gall, sharp and fresh, filling the climate-controlled air until it coated the back of my throat. I lunged forward, snapping photographs in a frenzy. Each shutter captured only stillness. The page already filled, the ink already glistening. The camera could not catch the hand that wrote, because there was no hand, only inscription, inevitable as gravity. Names I knew bloomed faster than I could process. Evelyn's own appeared, her death described with dispassionate detachment. Evelyn Shaw, of sudden failure in the lungs. July the 2nd. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her chest as though the words themselves had stolen her air. I begged her to leave the archive, to step outside its grasp. She refused. "If it writes me here," she said, "then it writes me everywhere." The crescendo built. Pages fluttered forward in rapid succession, the sound like wings beating in a confined space. Ink bled through, not confined to neat lines, but branching like veins across margins. The parchment swelled as though absorbing more deaths than its fibres could hold. The diary was no longer a book. It was a wound, opening forward in time. I leaned close, compelled despite myself, and saw words forming in the margin. My name again, Marcus Delaney. The script trailed into a description I could not force myself to read aloud. The letters shimmered wetly, still in the act of forming, as though the page exhaled them. The archive felt alive, The lamps dimmed, the fluorescence buzzed, shadows thickened until the room seemed narrower. The cases rattled like ribs under strain. I felt the air grow heavy, viscous, as if time itself had thickened. I realized then the core truth. History is not written by men. We are not the authors. We are authored. The manuscripts do not survive because we protect them. They survive because they must. They write us into being, and when their ink runs out, so do we. The diary's pages flipped faster, names spilling like floodwater. Hundreds, then thousands. I glimpsed leaders, disasters not yet on the news, dates that belonged to years we had not lived. The ink bled forward until I could no longer tell if the parchment carried words or wounds. Evelyn cried out and fled the room. I remained, paralyzed by the sight of my own death blooming on the page. I composed my resignation the way I have composed every report, in the dry cadences of protocol. No adjectives, no confession, only procedure. I titled it Anomalous Activity in MS 1665, Preliminary Observations. I described the diary, its provenance, its condition, its conservation status. I noted the irregularities of deposition, the failure of carbon dating, the impossibility of contamination. I buried the most damning evidence in phrases that carried the weight of bureaucracy. Further study recommended. Interpretation inconclusive. Anyone reading would dismiss it as the defensive hedging of a cautious scholar. That was my intent. My formal resignation followed 3 paragraphs later, cloaked in concern for my health and a wish to retire early from active teaching. 21 years is a respectable tenure. The dean, I imagined, would sigh and consider it inevitable. No one would question. Certainly no one would suspect that I was fleeing not from exhaustion, but from the act of being written. Yet outside the page, my silence was less professional. I cannot step into the archive without hearing it now. The faint, deliberate scratch of a quill in an empty room. It comes from nowhere and from everywhere at once. At first I mistook it for the hum of ventilation. But no, ventilation drones evenly. This is different. A dragging pause, a small lift, then a renewed stroke. The rhythm of handwriting, insistent. I avoid newspapers. Too often the headlines echo lines I saw days earlier in the diary. When news alerts arrive on my phone, I swipe them away, terrified the words will match those already fixed in that cramped 17th century hand. To read them would be to acknowledge that the book dictates, and that we are merely its obedient ink. I have not spoken to Evelyn since that night. Officially, she requested transfer to another hospital rotation. Unofficially, rumour insists she burned her notes, and perhaps even her copy of our data. I picture her face in the moment she saw her own death inscribed. The pallor, the trembling jaw. I cannot blame her for flight. Yet in fleeing she left me alone with the knowledge, and isolation magnifies everything. At times, I consider whether every ledger I ever handled carried the same infection of truth. The parish registers, the bills of mortality, the court documents, all of them written not after events but before, dictating who would succumb, who would endure. For 2 decades I believed I was studying testimony. Now I suspect I was studying verdicts. I recall the confidence with which I once dismissed superstition. Rats as omens, bells as warding, curses as contagion. I laughed them aside in lectures, delighted my audiences with rational dismissal. But what is a curse, if not the act of inscription? To name a death, and have the naming bring it to pass. Perhaps the old villagers were not wrong. They simply misunderstood the hand that held the quill. At night, I dream of ink veins running beneath the skin, black filaments threading through vessels, turning each of us into parchment for some unseen scribe. I wake with the taste of iron in my mouth, as though I had bitten down on a nail. My heart stutters, and I wonder if I will match the diary's calm declaration. Cessation of the heart, July the 4th. I considered destroying the volume. Fire, solvent, blade, but the thought collapses as soon as it forms. You cannot burn a tide to stop the moon. You cannot tear a ledger that writes you even as you lift the knife. To touch it is to be inscribed more deeply. Destruction, I suspect, would only accelerate the act. So the diary remains, sealed once more in its case, witness tapes intact, catalogued under a code only I and one archivist know. And yet I know the futility of locks. When the lights cut out, when the fluorescents buzz their last before silence, I swear I see reflection on the glass. The sheen of wet ink, letters forming in strokes too quick for the eye. For 21 years I believed history was a ledger, impartial and complete. Now I know the ledger writes us. We are its ink, and one page, one diary, still turns in the dark, writing me into silence.